Hello, everyone. My name is David Balton, and welcome to today's event convened by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today's event, entitled Scotland's Offer to the Arctic, is actually part of a series of events that we are putting on about both polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctica. For those of you who might be interested in viewing our previous events, I encourage you to go to our website where you will find them all. And next Monday, I also wish to announce yet another event, this one also about the Arctic. Monday, November 30th, we will have an event about the Arctic in a post-election world. And now for today's event, focusing on Scotland and its evolving relationship with the Arctic, I would like to thank those who helped to support this event, including the Government of Scotland, particularly the External Affairs Directorate. Thanks very much for your support. We also received support from the University of the Arctic, from our colleagues at the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program. We have ongoing support from both ATA Railway and the Olgunik Corporation. I would like to offer at the outset that the 8 nations that have territory north of the Arctic Circle are not the only entities with legitimate interests in the Arctic region. Other nations have long been involved in the Arctic, going back more than a century, and many have also obtained observer status at the Arctic Council, including the United Kingdom. As for Scotland, its Shetland Archipelago is only about 400 miles south of the Arctic Circle, and due to this proximity and for other reasons, there we go, there's a map for you. Scotland has recently stepped up its engagement with the Arctic. Last year, Scotland issued its first Arctic policy paper. You can find a link to that paper also on our website and the port of our website that announces this event. Today, we will hear about Scotland's interest in the Arctic from a key representative of the Scottish government. We will also hear perspectives on this from 2 other experts in the field. And with that, I am pleased to introduce to you Mr. Michael Russell of the Government of Scotland. Mr. Russell serves as Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe, and External Affairs. I note that Cabinet Secretary had other posts, including previously Scotland's Minister of the Environment. We also have with us Marianne Konings. She has had a long and distinguished career as an official for the European Union. She has served, among other things, as the EU's ambassador to Mexico, also their ambassador to Canada, where she was able to see a large part of Canada's Arctic. And I had the pleasure of working with Marianne in her most recent post, the first ever US ambassador at large for the Arctic. And finally, we have Anu Fredrickson. She is now the Executive Director of Arctic Frontiers. Many on the listening in may have been to Arctic Frontiers in previous years. I know I have been there a number of times. And she brings to this position extensive experience that she has had in the Arctic, including she served as director of the Arctic Economic Council. You can find the full biographies of each of our speakers on our website. The format for today's event, we will hear from each of these 3 speakers, initial presentations, and then we will have a lot of time for questions, answers, discussion. If those of you on the line wish to send in a question or a comment, you can do so in one of 2 ways. You can email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org. That's polar, P-O-L-A-R, at wilsoncenter.org. Or you can send us your questions and comments via Twitter at Polar Institute, I'll remind everyone of these 2 options when we get to that time. But without further ado then, I'd like to hear from our first speaker, Cabinet Secretary Russell. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to my fellow panelists and also to everybody who has and is attending this virtual event. I introduced myself as being very much the new boy, representing very much the new kid on the Arctic bloc. We are a small country a country in the process of change, a country in the process of redefining ourselves, and I think in the process of independence, but I can return to that if people wish me to later on. The context of what we are doing is set by the UK's process of Brexit. It is not the driver for what I'm going to talk about today, but it is very much the context in which the people of Scotland voted to remain in the EU, and unfortunately the UK is leaving the EU and creating a set of circumstances which are very difficult for us. So we are also looking at all our relationships and trying to understand our place in the world, not just our place in Europe, but our place in the world. Scotland is, as you pointed out, the world's northernmost non-Arctic nation. And the town of Lerwick, which I know very well, is closer to the Arctic Circle than it is to London. It is actually at a higher latitude than Juneau in Alaska. Our waters extend 200 miles into the Norwegian Sea and similarly into the North Atlantic Sea. Orkney and Shetland, the two island groups to the north of Scotland, were part of the Norwegian-Danish kingdom until the end of the 15th century. The area I live in and represent in the Scottish Parliament, Argyll and Bute, boasts a very strong Norse and Viking heritage. Scottish Arctic links are not new, and indeed they come into the recent past. One of the great names in recent Scottish polar history is William Spears Bruce, someone who I campaigned for in terms of trying to get him awarded the Polar Medal for some years, and I retain a strong interest in and link to the work that he did. And that work is very significant in terms of modern science, particularly the science of climate change. But in addition to geographical proximity and long-standing historical ties, our interest in greater collaboration within the Arctic stems from a realization of the challenges that we share with many other nations, including Arctic nations. 98% of Scotland's landmass is classified as rural, but it contains only 17% of our population. We have 96 inhabited islands. I represent 23 of them. And our rural and remote areas are experiencing substantial and continuing depopulation. The Highlands and Islands of Scotland are the least densely populated parts of Europe. Now, the nature and scale of our rurality is different from that of Alaska or the north of Canada. But when it comes to reversing depopulation, when it comes to localism and building communities, there is a strong correspondence in the challenges that we face and the challenges of depopulation that also lead to the decline in services and abilities to live in areas that we experience. By exchanging knowledge, by understanding perspectives, by learning from each other, we can learn to find the best solutions to the common problems. And that's one of the reasons why the Scottish Government became interested, first of all, in the Arctic and in looking at its Arctic policy. And we published our initial policy last year. It's not a geopolitical statement, and there are issues, for example, of security that we do need to continue to discuss and to look at, but it is a declaration of intent. It is perhaps the first calling card that we have, and we hand that calling card over in the hope that we can have a more productive dialogue and learn from each other and join in. And it is very much a community-focused approach. Scotland is a country that is very strong on community and very strong on building communities. And we recognize that in the nations and the areas in which we are looking at. But of course, there is, as I've said, a wider context. And one of the most important areas of context is the global challenge of climate change. We are one of the first countries to declare a climate emergency. We were one of the first countries to pass a comprehensive Climate Change Act. And we are very determined when we pay host to COP26 next year to play a role in working with other countries to set the planet on in a direction of green recovery, something that has been intensified by the challenge of COVID, because reconstructing and rebuilding after COVID requires us to recognize that this is something we must do within the context of the climate emergency. And we must not put that to one side in the hope that we can rush our way to some form of recovery, which will be neither secure nor sustainable. So as the event description today sets out, what we are trying to do is to define what we bring to the table, and what we wish to take from the table, to be crude about it. I think we can offer knowledge and expertise and I think we can take from this experience the experience of like-minded nations and like-minded peoples and like-minded communities. But as I said at the start, we're here to listen and to learn. I very much look forward to hearing you and to the other panelists and to hearing the questions. I suspect that when I answer it will be tentative and provisional, because I think we have a great deal to think about as we go forward. But we have started on the process, and in starting on the process, we intend to continue with it in parallel with our work to re-establish ourselves as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Russell. I now ask Marianne Konings for your remarks, please. The floor, ma'am, is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much to the Government of Scotland and the Polar Institute for inviting me. I will mainly focus my presentation on two key elements. I would like to say a word about what I think about the Scottish about the Scottish Arctic policy, and then the role of non-Arctic nations in the field of the Arctic. So when I start with the Scottish Arctic policy framework, in my 2 years experience as the EU ambassador, I have been reading, I would say, a lot of Arctic policies of many nations, which have, a lot of them have similar objectives. And although they are very important policy papers, if you read them, they're quite abstract, I would say. They use a lot of language which are very familiar for experts. What they are lacking a little bit is to give a real meaning in concrete what the objectives are. And here the Scottish Arctic policy framework is completely different. I would say it's one of the most refreshing policies I ever read. It is, and why it is, it's because it demonstrates in a very clear and practical way what concrete cases, examples there are to reach these objectives. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, it demonstrates this policy that Scotland has a lot of expertise to offer an experience in addressing problems which are already common to other Arctic regions. And they want to share this experience and best practices with others. And just to give one example, which I think is very important in the current Corona context, Scotland has really an expertise to education in rural and remote areas by using digital and state-of-the-art learning technologies. Scotland also, as the State Secretary said, that they want to listen. And here the paper, the Scottish Arctic Policy, identify specific areas where they say, we know an expertise exists elsewhere, we would like to learn. An example is Scotland wants to promote indigenous languages, and they have contacts with the Sami parliament in northern Sweden to see how they promote the indigenous languages and culture. The Scottish Arctic policy also demonstrates that already now Scotland is very well connected with key partners. And maybe an example here, Scotland is already part of the High North Atlantic Business Alliance network, which I think is very important, which consists of ports and economic development organizations in the North Atlantic, including for the US Maine and also Canada. And this is very important for Scotland that wants to become a hub, a transport and maritime hub in the North Sea. So the policy is very refreshing, and it's also very unique. It's very unique for the following reason. It gives, and the document is plenty of examples of how they have been supported. They show projects which have been supported by instruments of the European Union. So the European Union has an Arctic policy, which is supported by a lot of concrete, by major cooperation and assistance programs, which are not limited only to regions within the European Union Arctic, but also, I would say, elsewhere, also with Russia and others. But seldom these beneficiaries of nations, they mention that these achievements they have, these concrete projects, have been done thanks to the support of the European Union. So this is very unique, and the Scottish paper is full with concrete examples. It gives examples how it profited from major scientific research programs of the European Union. We have one of the biggest in the world, which is known as Horizon 2020. But also it gives examples, for example, of less well-known programs such as the Northern Periphery and Arctic program, where it connects regions like Scotland, Greenland, Iceland, and other Nordic regions. And just one example, I have to mention it because it's also linked to gender issues, which are very important also in the Arctic context. They have, together with all these regions, a woman power project that supports female entrepreneurship in sparsely populated communities and develop gender-aware business support. So finally, I would say that the Scottish Arctic policy is refreshing and unique and also innovative. I found it very interesting to read the key priorities, which are linked to, I think, priorities also in EU's Arctic policy and EU's policy in general, promoting green solutions, promoting connectivity. I hope that in the next EU Arctic policy, connectivity will be also extremely high on our agenda, and a strong focus on education and youth. I think youth is missing in a lot of Arctic policy. So I come to the second part, is the importance of Scotland as an active actor and a non-Arctic country. And here I would say that the Arctic as such is marked by a spirit of cooperation and not confrontation. And cooperation is key in all the areas. I would say that I was always really impressed that such a high degree of cooperation, for example, exists among scientific research on the Arctic, which is unique. So cooperation also between nations, and the reason why it works so well in the Arctic is, one of the reasons is that the challenges to be addressed can only be addressed if nations work together and they are engaged on the major challenges which has been mentioned, like addressing climate change, protecting the fragile environment of the Arctic, and also promoting sustainable development, because these are not local challenges, these are global challenges. And global challenges can only be addressed if all countries work together, and no country or group of countries can deal with it alone. And also for this reason, the role and involvement of all nations, including nations, non-Arctic one like Scotland's, are vital. And I qualify this as the need for inclusiveness with regard to the Arctic file. And I mentioned it in all my interventions. Inclusive means that everybody who can contribute, who wants to engage in finding solutions, they should be able to participate. Of course, you have the Arctic Council, you have the Arctic states, you have 8 Arctic states, members of the Arctic Council, but the Arctic Council is a relatively close club, and they do not deal with all Arctic issues which are important for the Arctic. There are other organizations, for example, multilateral, the UN, dealing with climate change, which are important for the Arctic, but also, and this is a relatively, I would say, new development, is the growing importance of international fora or big conferences, which are open for everybody, which are inclusive. Famous examples are major conferences are the Arctic Frontiers, and I'm very glad that we have in our panel the new executive director, Anu Fredrickson, here with us. Another major conference is the Arctic Circle Assembly, which yearly takes place in Reykjavik with about 3,000 participants, very high level, where last year, for example, there was a really brilliant intervention of John Kerry, speaking on climate change and the Arctic, but also Scotland is very active at these conferences. And the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has been participating and is extremely popular, I would say, in these circles. So just to say that it's important, the inclusiveness, including Scotland as a non-Arctic state. So I want to conclude on that, that as you can note, I'm very impressed and enthusiastic about the Scottish Arctic policy. I'm impressed by the active involvement and international stand of Scotland and the strong engagement. And this is not only appreciated, but it's definitely indispensable. And I hope that Scotland will continue to use a very strong voice and a strong engagement on the Arctic file, especially also after Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I had to chuckle when you said at the outset, you told us about your reaction to reading the Scottish Arctic policy paper. It's exactly the same reaction I had. And I say this as someone who was involved in developing the two US national Arctic policy statements years ago. And of course, with so many people and a very large government, it turned out rather bureaucratic in the language. And the Scottish paper was just a lot, well, refreshing to use your word. I had the same reaction. Thanks very much. Now let us turn to our final panelist, Anu Fredrickson, Arctic Frontiers. Ma'am, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dave. Mr. Cabinet Secretary, dear Marianne, dear friends, thank you so much for having me today. I would like to start my remarks by reflecting on the current global discussion on the Arctic. Some of the buzzwords that we currently hear include sovereignty, decision-making, interests, and conflicts of interest. But today, I would like to provide the perspective of an Arctic citizen, the perspective of someone who on a daily basis works for different types of dynamics and inclusiveness. I will focus on the Arctic versus global dynamics and on Arctic as a platform for international dialogue and learning. I will first touch upon the societal development and then discuss the mutual dependence between the Arctic and the rest of the world through trade. So firstly, a few words about our societies. The excellent report, Business Index in the North 2020, reveals that in terms of absolute numbers, we are losing people in the European Arctic. This is highly relevant, not just from a society building perspective, but also from business and security policy perspective. Because societies and businesses need people in order to thrive. And from a security policy perspective, our best guarantee for stability is having people living in the high north. But in order to make that happen, we need to build attractive societies. The status in the European Arctic currently is that we are facing a sudden migration of our youth, and especially of our young women. In other words, our societies are becoming older and more masculine. This has led to some people to call for even an Arctic version of Tinder. I prefer the Women Power Initiative, which Marianne mentioned. But anyway, words such as remote, vast, and sparsely populated are used to describe the Arctic. But these are not features that make our region unique. Because the challenges faced by remote communities are not always Arctic specific. And even while using the word delighted might not be a proper one in this case, I still say that I was really delighted to hear and to read of the similar challenges that you so well describe in the Scottish Arctic Policy Framework, because you really wonderfully laid out the learning opportunity that we have between the Arctic region and Scotland. The bottom line is that whether in the Arctic or further south, attractive and well-functioning societies are not built on protected areas, nor on state subsidies. We need to be able to offer opportunities to our youth, and that means that we need to facilitate growth and responsible development. That, in turn, brings with it the element of stability. And here, a recognition that our challenges are not unique to the Arctic actually opens up a whole range of opportunities for collaboration and learning. The second issue that I would like to touch upon has to do with the mutual dependence. And here I'd especially like to focus on trade. Looking at the global development, we are expecting 2 billion people to take the leap into middle class within the next 2 decades. And these people, what do they need? Well, they need proteins, they need energy, and they need minerals to power the green transition. And here, Arctic is a part of the solution. Why do we believe in the growing relevance of the Arctic? It's not just because of the abundance of natural resources that are expected to be found in the Arctic. It's also because if you turn the map upside down and look from North Pole and down, you actually see that the Arctic unites almost 80% of global economy. So we are, in a way, a hub. If we then look at the Arctic economies, in general, we are quite small, we are economically homogeneous, and we are very export-driven. This means that there is a low degree of diversification, which in turn means that we do little trade amongst each other, which again means that we are dependent on having access to the global markets. This leads to a mutual dependence. Arctic needs trade routes and access to global value chains, but the Arctic can also be a solution provider to the rest of the globe. Arctic businesses, societies and regions are interested in collaboration on a global level. And if we look at the potential for collaboration, especially from a European Arctic perspective, there's one practical example that I'd like to highlight, namely that of renewable energy. Of all the electricity provided or produced in the Nordic Arctic area, 85% is renewables. We often have a surplus of energy production, and I know that that is also the case of Orkney. Now, currently there are ongoing processes, both in the European Arctic, but also in Scotland, to work on further development of hydrogen and ammonia as a storage opportunity. This can actually help us bypass the need for costly cross-border infrastructure, but it can also provide us with the solution for utilization of renewable energy elsewhere. We are in the midst of a crisis with the global pandemic. And in these times, it is even more crucial that we build partnerships and learn from one another. Countries have different exit strategies, and they also have different support mechanisms when they are rebuilding their economy. But the decisions that we make now, as a part of our rebuilding plan, will have long-lasting effects on sustainability. And while our communities, as remote as they are, might be less exposed to COVID-19, our economy is not. Slowdown of international business and globalization can particularly affect the Arctic economy. So in these times of transition, my call is to let the Arctic become an incubator for good ideas. Let us showcase globally how we can develop in a sustainable manner. And perhaps the solutions that we come up here in the high north can also work in other areas, and vice versa. So to conclude, the Arctic does not operate in a vacuum. We cannot, nor do we want to, put up a sign, "Do not disturb." There is a great deal of interdependence. We are dependent on having access to the global arenas and the global markets for the sake of our development and for the sake of our trade. But we can also play a significant part in the green transition. The Arctic can provide solutions on a global level, and this can best be achieved through collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anu. I particularly liked your suggestion, your call that the Arctic should become an incubator for good and innovative ideas. I can think of times that that has already happened, and I think, like you, there is the potential for much more of that. So now, to those of you in the audience, again, I'd remind you, if you wish to submit questions or thoughts or comments for me or any of our panelists, you have two options. You can email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org. That's polar@wilsoncenter.org. Or you can use Twitter. You can find us at Polar Institute. And while we have some questions coming in, I would like to take the prerogative as a moderator to pose an initial question, at least to Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell, the title of today's event, Scotland's Offer to the Arctic, we actually took from a portion of your recent policy statement. What is that offer exactly? You sort of alluded to it, and what are you hoping really to offer up, and what are you hoping more specifically to get back in return?
I think the paper, and I'm grateful to Marianne and yourself for commenting so positively on it. I'm sure that the authors of it will be absolutely delighted, though we do try to be a little bit more innovative in what we publish than some other governments. I think the paper is quite clear about that. There are a whole range of areas where we think we have common issues, and where either we have done some things that we think are of interest, or which we can identify other people are doing things of interest, and we want to exchange those views. So it is essentially this solidarity. It is solidarity and learning. I'm already making little notes as I go along in this, and Anu, for example, has got me thinking about trade and innovation. I don't think we emphasized probably some of those things enough in what we were thinking about. And we'll probably go away and look at those and perhaps have a conversation with her and her colleagues about how we need to rethink that. And I think my colleague, Ivan McKee, one of my fellow ministers, will want to talk to her about that. We have a comparatively small team of government ministers, so we expect people to be active across portfolios. So I think each of my colleagues will want to engage with some issues which they have identified and take those forward. I've mentioned climate change because I'm a former environment minister, but I'm also, the longest portfolio I ever held was in education. And I do believe that there are some very big issues in education and in research particularly, which we need to follow up. Brexit closes some doors in research. I would want to open some doors up again. Within the area I represent, for example, the Scottish Association for Marine Science has a major facility. They have an active role in Arctic research. I want them to do more, and I want them to do more in collaboration. So I think it's getting to know you time, and once we get through getting to know you time, I think we'll be more accurate about what we have to exchange as friends.
Oops. Thanks very much. Marianne, I had a question for you. As you were speaking about the EU's engagement in the Arctic, it occurred to me, not for the first time, that the EU and the United States are a little bit alike in this respect. We have portions of our area that are in the Arctic and others that are close to and care a lot about the Arctic. But then there are other portions, certainly in the United States, where people live far from the Arctic and probably don't think about the Arctic all that much. And yet it's important to come up with some national policy. And so for the EU, I'm wondering, why is the Arctic so important, and how do you convince people who are living, say, in Greece about the need to pay attention to the Arctic? You need to unmute, Marianne. You have to unmute your device.
Unmute, okay.
Very good.
I would say that in the first place, the European Union is an Arctic entity because, as you say, part of the European Union territory are in the Arctic. And I always say this because I remember when I go to conferences at which US Senator Markowski speaks, she always explains that the US is an Arctic state because of Alaska. So we are an Arctic entity because we have 3 Arctic states, and by extension we also include Norway and Iceland, which are part of the European Economic Zone. And this is not only a geographical or dogmatic issue. It means that EU legislation is being applied on the Arctic, on the European Arctic, that are very high norms and very high standards in different fields like climate change, safety of shipping, mining, environmental standards are being applied in the European Arctic, and so contributing to solutions in it. And I don't think that we have a lot of difficulties to convince all member states. If you see, for example, the observers in the Arctic Council, we have a growing number also of EU member states who are observers at the Arctic Council. And when I was ambassador to the Arctic, I have been 3 times, I had been invited, for example, to Italy. And in Italy, they have at a university in Rome, they have a master's on the Arctic. So I don't think that you have to explain that the Arctic concerns the whole European Union. And it's also, we have a strategic interest in the Arctic because of some of the developments that Anu mentioned. These developments, particularly in key sectors like energy, mining, shipping, are so fundamental that they are affecting European policies on which we will have to adapt. Take into account that 50% of energy, for example, of gas, import of energy of gas comes from the Russian Arctic. We have a huge percentage, more than 4% of fish imported in Europe comes from the Arctic. And finally, the Arctic is strategically important for the European Union because of geopolitical developments. And here you see that we all have an interest that the Arctic remains an area of low tension, and therefore we will have to take it into account. So the Arctic is strategic for the European Union because we want to have an Arctic that is stable, prosperous, that's sustainable, and that's secure.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. Indeed, some questions are already starting to come in. I think we'll be returning to this question of stability in the Arctic. But first, a final question from me for Anu. And here I'd like to harken back to your experience as executive director of the AEC, the Arctic Economic Council, as much as your current position with Arctic Frontiers. When you look at Scotland, and particularly the private sector in Scotland, do you see potential for further or additional engagement of companies in Scotland in Arctic activities? What do you think? What do you think the potential is?
That's a great question, Dave. Thank you. Firstly, I want to start by commenting the work that is done by the Highland and Islands enterprises. They have really, together with the Scottish government, helped raise your profile in the Arctic and also brought to our attention the competence that you have. Some issues or some sectors where we see great collaboration potential going forward, that includes port development and infrastructure in general, renewable energy production, which I already mentioned, shipping was mentioned by Marianne. There's no doubt about it that with the increased numbers of Arctic traffic and especially maritime traffic in the Arctic, there is great potential also for transshipment hub development. And Scotland, with its strategic location, is excellent, has an excellent starting point there. Then blue economy goes without saying. That's already a sector where you do fantastic work. It's also an emerging sector on a pan-Arctic scale. So that's something where I do see great collaboration opportunities. And then tourism development. I think that we, our Arctic communities, have a lot to learn from you. And I know that actually quite a bit of learning has already taken place. Delegations locally here from Norway, northern Norway, have visited Scotland to learn from your entrepreneurs.
Okay, thank you, Anu. Well, now I'm going to start taking questions that have already come in from the audience. And I'll start with this one for you, Mr. Cabinet Secretary. So for many years, since the end of the Cold War, the Arctic has actually been a highly cooperative, low tension region. Of late, there has been a cloud over some of that. There has been a rise in what some people refer to as great power competition, born of friction between the United States and Russia, China perhaps. As Scotland looks ahead to engage further in the Arctic, are you at all concerned about getting enmeshed in this type of competition? Are you hoping to somehow skirt that? What's your sense of this situation as it relates to Scotland?
Well, I would be hoping to avoid it. I certainly don't wish to be enmeshed in that. Let's step back for a moment and just recognise where Scotland presently is and what the issues are then as Scotland changes and develops. Scotland is not an independent state, sovereign state. It is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In the last century, we do things very slowly in Scotland, particularly constitutionally. In the last century or so, that situation has gradually changed. And now there is a restored Scottish Parliament, which was prorogued for 300 years, which is rather a long time, but came back into existence in 1999. And it has a range of responsibilities which have, I think, grown twice since then. Presently, opinion polls would indicate that there is a majority in Scotland for independence. Brexit has been part of that process and not the entire reason for it. There was a referendum in 2014, which was lost very narrowly. And I think, well, 55 to 45, that figure has remained reasonably static and then started to grow. And as I say, I think all the opinion polls this year have shown a majority for independence. It is not as easy as simply declaring independence. The constitutional settlement that we have means that has to be agreed. A referendum has to be agreed between England and Scotland, and that has not been agreed as yet, and the current UK government does not wish to agree it. But assuming that we're moving in that direction, then moving in that direction in a collaborative way, as a non-nuclear state, and that's really important to us. We are very much have a non-nuclear view. Moving in that way and into a position of collaboration on the European, because we intend to rejoin the EU, in the European sphere, defence sphere, and also NATO, which we think is inevitable for a country of our size and given our geographical position. We want to do that collaboratively and with others, but not to be enmeshed in power plays. We tend to be a bit resistant to that. We're not easy people to push around, and our view is that we would like to work with others, but we're not going to be dragooned into doing certain things. So this is a step at a time. The constitutional settlement in the UK is, if I may misuse the word, Byzantine in its complexity, and it's going to take some unraveling. But bit by bit, we're getting there, and we're conscious of these issues, and we approach them cautiously, I think you would say.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Russell, while I have you, there's one fairly specific question that came in. I'm not entirely sure how engaged you may be personally on it. One of the ongoing environmental issues relating to the Arctic is playing out at the International Maritime Organization, and it concerns the question of whether ships transiting the Arctic should use or carry heavy fuel oil. Perhaps you're familiar with this. There is a kind of compromise proposal currently on the table. There are a number of groups that believe the compromise is unworkable or too weak. I'm wondering, has Scotland engaged in this through the UK? Do you have any independent view of how this should go in the future?
That would be well beyond my area of knowledge and competence at this particular moment. I'm very happy, as I often do, to say I need to go away and find that out. And if necessary, we would take a position on it. But it would be wrong of me to comment on it now, because I'd be doing so out of ignorance. That wouldn't help anybody.
Okay. Thank you. Anu, a question for you. You had mentioned that at least in the Nordic part of the Arctic, something like 85% of energy comes from renewable resources. We have a question what fraction of this is hydropower and what is other things among the 85%? Do you know?
I do not have the exact numbers, but the absolute majority is hydropower. We do have remarkable potential in the European Arctic for wind power development, but that is still in the starting phase, at least compared to hydropower, which has been operating for decades already.
Okay. We have a question. I'm not entirely sure who it's for. Let me just read it then. And I have heard about this. I saw this in the news. The United Kingdom recently announced agreements with both Greenland regarding fisheries and with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein regarding free movement of goods. Question is, how will these developments impact Scotland's ongoing relationships, particularly in the West Nordic area? Does this only relate to goods or also potentially extend to persons and services? This is a question. Maybe, yes?
Perhaps these are more to do with the process of Brexit than they are to do with anything else. The UK is in the process of trying to devise and secure, first of all, a crossover of existing arrangements between the EU and a variety of places, and then to build upon that. It's a lengthy, complex process. It delves into a whole set of relationships that exist between Scotland and the UK on the issue of Brexit. Broadly, we would be part of that because there would be agreements between the UK and trading partners who exist within in a trading relationship with the EU and will be in a trading relationship with the UK. The wider issues of how the overall relationship with the UK and the EU is still being played out in negotiation. And that will be, in my view, of more importance. And it is very difficult to predict what will happen in those circumstances. It's been a long and tortuous 4.5 years, and alas, it is not over yet.
Indeed. Another question has come in for you, Mr. Cabinet Secretary, relating to the Arctic Council. So as I mentioned at the outset, I think everyone knows, the UK has, for many years, actually a very long time, been an observer at the Arctic Council. At least for now, is Scotland, do you have plans to engage as part of the EU Arctic Council observer delegation in a greater way? Do you anticipate down the road seeking separate observer status at the Arctic Council, perhaps as the independence movement you have alluded to moves forward?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm always willing to be surprised, but I doubt whether the UK would encourage us to be an active member of the UK delegation. But were it to do so, I'd welcome that, of course. I think that our view is that we should find a way to continue and develop our association short of independence, but that requires legal personality, which is one of the differences, for example, between us and the Faroes. We don't have full legal personality because that's not the structure of the UK. So we will find a way to do this. There are a number of ways to do this, and we're actively exploring those.
Okay. Anu, a question for you. In light of what you've said about collaboration and building communities that can thrive in the Arctic, would you be in favor, would you support the idea of a forum for collaborative and interactive exchange on public safety for rural and indigenous communities? And this is a question coming from Alaska, where this issue is, of some significant moment. What do you think about this?
I think it sounds like a great idea. I think that where we still have room for improvement on the Arctic scale is the regional dialogue. We have well-functioning multilateral organizations. We are off to a good start with the development of business collaboration, for example, in the margins of the Arctic Economic Council. But where we still have room for improvement is the direct dialogue between regional stakeholders. So yes.
Okay. Marianne, one for you now. Someone probably from China writes in, I am wondering whether the EU, the European Union, regards itself as a regulatory power in the Arctic. What kind of regulatory influence does the EU have on Arctic governance? So I'm not entirely sure what's being asked here, but maybe you can sort that out, and I'd be curious for your reaction to the question. Again, please unmute yourself.
There we go. Regulatory power, I think that by all the European legislation and the norms and regulations that they work out, which are applied not only in the European Union as such, but also in countries which are in the European Economic Zone, like Iceland and Norway, which means that all these norms related to high standards, they are already applied, I would say, within the European Union and the larger European area. And this is a kind of standard setting that we are doing, a very high standard setting. And also when, for example, I was ambassador to Canada, and with the negotiations with the trade agreements, we try also to have this kind of high norms and regulations also adopted, or to have recognition with our partners, so that we all have high standards in our trade relations with key partners, so that actually the high norms become applicable on a more global level. In that sense, I think we are playing not so much specifically to the Arctic, but globally we playing a role as regulatory power. I want to say a word about the heavy fuel and the discussions going on, if you don't mind, in the International Maritime Organization. The use of heavy fuel in the Arctic shipping is a major problem. And although some of the countries have said they are ready for a ban of heavy fuel, I think that it's a key problem in case, for example, there would be an oil spill in the Arctic. It would be a real catastrophe. It's a catastrophe in non-Arctic waters, but it would even be worse there, not only because the search and rescue operations will be difficult, but also the really bad effects of oil pollution for the Arctic and the fauna. And therefore, one of the positions of the European Union is, together with the member states, is to go for a ban of heavy fuel in the Arctic. And this is being where we work in the International Maritime Organizations. But at the same time, it's absolutely key. And here, Anu mentioned it, it's a hydrogen power where especially Scotland has such an experience also by using hydrogen for ferry boats. I was reading in this fascinating Arctic paper that also you have examples, Scotland, of having the first passenger ferry boats only working on hydrogen. So I think that there should be not only a ban of heavy fuel in the Arctic, but also there should be more and more the use of hydrogen and other alternative renewable energies for transport in the Arctic.
I think in just to be absolutely accurate, we have two of those ships under construction. I passed both of them today on my way to the Parliament, but they are not yet in operation. But we're very much looking forward to them being in operation. So once they're out there, we'll know how it goes.
Okay, thanks to both of you. We have a question now also dealing with energy of a different kind, perhaps mostly for you, Mr. Russell, but others may have a view of this too. The question has to do with energy transition taking place in Shetland, away from oil and gas and towards more renewable energy. How is the government planning to replace the well-paying jobs in the oil and gas sector? And what lessons can Scotland offer for Arctic communities, including in North America, where a number of them are heavily dependent on oil and gas for jobs and economic development, but who also presumably will need to transition away from these things in the coming years? Do you have any thoughts about that, sir?
Yeah, we are in transition. I mean, this is not saying what we're looking forward to. We are in transition, and therefore the responsibility and the desire for this has to come from companies themselves, and is coming from companies themselves. We know that we're reaching the end of that particular energy source. And therefore we have to find ourselves, and it's not simply because it's running out, though it is running out, but not completely, but because we need to move on to something else. I'm very interested in what Marianne has said on heavy fuel oil, and I suspect my sympathies will very much lie in what she's said. Equally, we have to make sure that we move on from oil as an economic driver. And the companies know that. That's what they're working on. And we need to, as a government, work with them to move from one set of energy assumptions to another one. Now, we need a broadly based energy mix. You can't simply say, well, we're going to go from this massive thing to that massive thing. And an industrial base, you have to find a way forward. And the way forward is to make sure the companies are motivated, the companies are planning it, the companies have support to do so, and that there's the alternatives are going in place. Not just wind power, not just onshore or offshore wind power, the very important developments in tidal power that have taken place, the work that's been done at AMEC in Orkney is particularly impressive, where we now know what works and what is beginning to work well, and to make sure that all that mix is in there and is available to take over. So it's the companies, and the jobs then go with that. You know, if the companies are investing, they're looking forward, they realize they're in transition and one thing is changing into another thing, then the jobs go with that. And, you know, so far so good. There will always be purists on this who say, you know, doing it today is too late. There will be others who say, let's not do it at all because we need to stay where we are. The reasonable proposition is to say the companies will change. They know they have to change. It's not an option. And certainly if you look, for example, at our plan to phase out vehicles that are powered by diesel and petrol, that's in place. The 2030 commitment is there. Our climate change commitments are in place. You know, then we say, that's real. That's what we're going to do. And then companies come in and say, right, let's meet that challenge and make sure things happen. Now, in addition to that, the COVID-19 demands for change may accelerate and drive parts of that in different directions, and we should be open to that as well. So those plans have to keep being revised and thought through as we look about what happens in the coming year and in the coming years as we recover from this extraordinary shock to the system.
Okay. I have a question both for Marianne and for Anu, and it's sort of based on a couple of different questions that have come in from the audience. I'll try to bring them together. The topic is the engagement of subnational entities in Arctic policy. Scotland, of course, its situation is unique to Scotland, but there are in the circumpolar region entities in sort of federal systems that have their own interest and some autonomy and decision-making authority within respective countries that play in the Arctic region. Alaska within the United States, 3 of Canada's territories, Yukon, Northwest, and Territory in Nunavut. I'm wondering how you see the engagement of subnational entities, potentially including Scotland, if you consider Scotland a subnational entity, and whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for the Arctic region. Does it complicate matters? Does it enrich matters? What is your take on this? Who wants to go first? Anu, you look like you have something on the tip of your tongue.
Yes, that's a great question. And there are very many ways to approach this, but if I choose to approach this first from the business perspective, then business knows no borders. And therefore, Arctic businesses, as I said in my opening remarks, are dependent on having access to the markets. And there, it doesn't really make difference whether those markets are within another Arctic country or whether they are within another region. There's a very direct interest for us to collaborate with all stakeholders. Then from a policy perspective, that's of course another game, and I'm sure that our colleagues in different ministries have their own views about that, but the Arctic countries have always underlined that the decision-making authority in the Arctic remains within those national governments. As a private person, as an Arctic citizen, I tend to agree with that, but at the same time, I do firmly believe that collaboration is the key for the success also for the Arctic. And that collaboration needs to also include those that come from outside the region.
David?
Yes,
Is there
go
a
ahead.
problem?
No, go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. The cooperation among regions, I think this is something very special, which we know within the European Union, where also we have a committee of the regions, and with regions with different autonomy status and so on. But particularly to the when we look at the regions in the Arctic, the different one with also different status, that we consider it one of the success stories of the Arctic is the very close cooperation that there is between the different sub-regions of the regions in the Arctic. To give you a concrete example, there are, for example, special programs also of the European Union, which involve the Nord offices in North Sweden, North Finland, and North Norway, and also regions in Russia, where we have been managing, it's a Northern Dimension program, for example, we have been managing extremely useful cooperation between these different regions. So it's not only limited to the European, but also I would say definitely non-EU regions, and particularly I would say a success story with working European EU regions together with the Russian northern regions. You know, we have a quite difficult relationship. There are a lot of clouds in the relationship between the European Union and Russia, but on the Nordic dimension and Northern policies and the region, we work extremely well because it's on the sub-region, it's people-to-people contact, and it's cross-border programs. So we have rather a positive experience with them. And I thought also that in the American Arctic, that you have also quite a lot of cooperation between Alaska and also the northern territories, also trying to promote mobility and so on. So I think that there are quite a lot of good examples, and it's needed to have this kind of cooperation. I don't understand you. Okay.
Sorry. Yes, I certainly agree. And there's even cooperation across the Bering Strait between communities in Alaska and those in Chukotka, Russia. Mr. Russell, interesting questions come in. So the situation of Greenland, I don't know how closely you follow that, but there are some analogies. Greenland within the Kingdom of Denmark has some significant degree of autonomy, could be headed toward greater autonomy, even potential complete independence someday. Sitting where you are in Edinburgh, do you see any parallels between the two circumstances of Scotland and Greenland? Do you really think each situation is more different than it is alike?
I think you rightly said earlier on that, you know, Scotland is in a unique position. Every country, every part of every country, you know, that debates these issues is in a unique position. There are parts of Europe, you know, which have similarities, but the Scottish case, I suppose, is founded upon a number of things. Scotland is quite clearly a nation. We have our own legal system. We have our own education system. We have elements of our own language. Indeed, not only do we have Gaelic, but the poet T.S. Eliot said that we spoke English better than anywhere else in the world too. So, you know, we tend to have our own position. In those circumstances, I don't make direct comparisons. I have great sympathy for people who want to, go their own way, do their own thing. But in terms of how I argue this case, I argue this case on the basis of the Scottish democratic right as expressed by the people of Scotland, which has been moving towards this position, as I said, for over 100 years. If you look at the campaign in the late 19th century for a campaign called Campaign for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, then you saw the establishment of the devolved parliaments over a period of time. One essentially over 50 years it took before they were done, and now a process towards independence where it's clearly moving into a majority position. I think that speaks for itself, and I don't tend to speak for other people.
Very sensible. Thank you for that. Another question has come in for you, if I could tax you a little bit further. We haven't talked very much, at least, about the roles and rights of indigenous peoples in the Arctic. But I can tell you from my experience, it is a fundamental aspect of life in the Arctic region to give a voice to and involve in decision-making people whose ancestors have actually lived there for millennia. And if Scotland is to step up its engagement in the Arctic in the ways that you have described, in the ways that the policy paper Scotland has issued describe, are you prepared to engage with the Arctic indigenous communities and support them in their efforts?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, again, every country is different, every area is different, but, you know, absolutely engage. Marianne mentioned languages within our paper and minority languages, and I think that's an important part of our own issue. We have the Scottish writer William McIlvanney describes Scotland as a mongrel nation, which I think is a great description of how we are. We're a very mixed nation, but we do have an issue with a number of language issues, and particularly with the Gaelic language. I myself used to live in the Western Isles. I know the issue very well. And we have issues of language retention. Languages all over the world are subject to attrition and pressure. You know, the world loses a language every fortnight. We really need to focus on how we take forward the language issue, and that there are parallel issues in Finland, for example. There are parallel issues. There are issues in a variety of places which we can engage with. But I think on the question of engagement with indigenous peoples, of course, I think it's extremely important that we do that, and that we do that in a constructive manner. And I think that's one of the more exciting aspects. Not that everything isn't exciting, but one of the more exciting aspects of how we take these things forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anu, a question wasn't directed to you specifically, but I will direct it to you if you don't mind. The question as it reads, can you outline a roadmap to grow sustainable and thriving economies in remote regions, including Scotland, perhaps the focus here, I think, is in the Western US and Canada, that does not rely on extracting resources for the near or medium term future? Is there a path here that you see?
That's a tricky one. What comes to my mind immediately are questions related to energy. Where do we get that? That needs to be transported. How do we do that? I think that that's something that's still ahead of us. As an optimist, at least I'd like to think that way. But currently, if we are at least to provide the modern standards of living, if that's our aim, it will be difficult to craft a roadmap for that in the immediate future without having access to minerals and other resources. Because what is often what is, in my opinion, undercommunicated is our growing need for minerals if we are to go through and fulfill our ambitions for green transition.
Okay. We are coming near to the end of the questions. There's one specific one for you, Mr. Russell, deals with a topic I'm not familiar with, perhaps you are. Peatland, P-E-A-T, peatland burning has been the subject of growing discussion in the UK and in Scotland. And the point here is that peat is a carbon sink, and I suppose burning it sort of removes its efficacy as a sink. Do you have a view about how this issue should play out in Scotland, given the competing needs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and having carbon sinks, but also the need for energy?
I'm very familiar with it, having as an ex-environment minister and also as somebody who knows the Western Isles particularly well. There is no, well, it's not 100% accurate. There is virtually no commercial extraction of peat in Scotland. There is commercial extraction of peat in Ireland, and indeed the power station that's run by peat in Ireland, I think, is now due to close, and there's some considerable concern about it. But in Scotland, there's no commercial removal of peat. There is, however, some small-scale domestic removal, which is an indigenous activity. So we then move into the area of looking at that and being part of the underpinning of the indigenous communities, particularly in the Western Isles, which does create some difficulties. There's two things we need to do. I think that the small scale nature of the use of peat for domestic fuel is probably tolerable within the medium term. But it is necessary on a larger scale to invest in peatland restoration. And the real problem with peat is not the removal of peat, and this is going to farm up too much detail and people are now keeling over probably with the amount of detail, but the real problem is not the removal for domestic consumption and domestic burning. It is that climate change dries out peatland, and therefore the sink that peatland is, it no longer exists. Peatland restoration is not cheap, but it's a very effective way of challenging climate change, and therefore part of our mix of activities on climate change is peatland restoration. The issue of burning of it is significant, but it's not vast. And I think therefore, one could probably manage that situation over a period of time.
Okay. I'd like to start bringing our discussion to a close, and I thought I might offer each of you the floor one more time. If you have final thoughts or a question for one of your co-panelists or a question for me, and then we will wrap this up. And I'll start in the reverse order in which we began our session with you, Anu. Any final thoughts from you?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for an excellent cooperation. And thank you also for, let's say, an active stance on Arctic and for your interest in development of the region and in collaboration with us. I think that is an excellent starting point and something that we welcome more of. Because like I started my remarks with, we do not live in a vacuum. And it is also in the interest of the Arctic that we develop together with our global partners.
Thank you very much, Anu. Marianne, what are your final thoughts?
Yes, I also want to thank you very much. And also I can only echo the words of Anu that we appreciate quite a lot the very specific situation and the engagement, the very active engagement of Scotland on a number of issues on the Arctic, and particularly their innovative approach. I'm sure that a lot of other regions in the Arctic will be able to profit from their expertise. And I can only wish them good luck. Also, you will always be able to count Scotland on a very active partnership with the European Union and a very strong support.
Thanks very much, Marianne. And Mr. Cabinet Secretary, the floor is yours for a final time.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your convening of this. It's been very helpful, and thank you to the Wilson Centre. This is the first time I've taken part in an event with the Wilson Centre. I hope I'll do it again. I want to thank Marianne and Anu too, because I think that, I have learned something from both of them, and I think the keynote of this is where I started. Scotland has an intention to move forward with its policy, but it's dipped its toe in the water. It quite likes what it's found, and we're very grateful for the kind words about it. We need to back that up with real work, and that is what we will do. And we want to also to learn from people. So I think it's pretty certain that our team will be talking to the other people in this panel, picking up issues that have arisen out of this discussion, and continue to take it forward. We are very much in transition. I mean, we see ourselves in that way. We've been in transition for a while, and unfortunately, the nature of transition is you never know when it's over. But we will continue with that transition, and part of that transition will be to work closely with our friends and neighbours. And that is the point I leave with, we are neighbours. For a very long time, we have spent most of our time looking south. I think it is far beyond time that we look north. And I think we like what we see, and we'd like to do more of it.
Thank you, Michael. Those are wise words. And I, for one, know a lot about the vagaries of transition, particularly at the current moment. So with that, I want to thank each of our panelists, Michael Russell, Anne-Marie Konings, and Anna Fredrickson. That was a wonderful discussion. I really do appreciate your taking the time to be with us. I want to thank all of our listeners for staying with us, for all of you who submitted questions. I hope I got to most of them. I hope I did justice to those that I tried to combine in some way. I would encourage those of you who are interested in the Arctic to come back and see us on Monday, where we'll have another panel thinking about the most recent US election and what it might mean for the future of the Arctic. Indeed, Marianne will be back with us there. We're looking forward to seeing you again. Let me thank once again the co-sponsors of our event and my colleagues at the Wilson Center who are behind the scenes, who make all this happen magically. It's really unbelievable. We are getting more experience in doing these virtual meetings like everyone else. Still, there's a lot of work that goes into making an event like this happen. Thank you very much for all of that. With that, I wish you all a pleasant day. I hope someday soon our paths can cross in person, and happy holidays to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.